What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And today we're talking about a story that has haunted Tennessee for over a decade, yet I feel like far too few people have ever heard of this, which is very surprising because to me, it feels like the modern day Sodder children. Like when I first started looking into this case, I kept thinking, there's no way this has happened within the past, like just over a decade. I kept believing this has to be decades old. Like you just don't hear cases like this very often, and there's not the coverage on it that I thought there would be, which is absolutely baffling because this case is also the longest running Amber Alert in the history of Tennessee. This Amber Alert was put out in 2012 and it is still active. In September of 2012, two children, 9-year-old Chloie Leverette and 7-year-old Gage Daniel, were living a quiet life with their grandparents in a small town of Unionville, Tennessee. But that peaceful life was shattered one night when the family home burned in a horrific fire to the ground. Chloie and Gage's grandparents were both found in the rubble, and initially authorities assumed the worst, obviously, that the children were in there with them and had perished in the fire as well. However, after countless searches, the troubling realization emerged that there was no trace of either child. And so again, this tragedy triggered what has become Tennessee's longest running active Amber Alert. And to this day, no one has any idea what truly happened that night or where Chloie and Gage might be. This case is so frustrating and heartbreaking and confusing, and their family, especially their mom, has spent the last decade still trying to find answers, still trying to find her kids. So let's get into the details to help bring Chloie and Gage home. 9-year-old Chloie and 7-year-old Gage were being raised by their grandparents, Leon Bubba McLaren and Molly McLaren, in the quiet farming area of Unionville, Tennessee. It's a really small town about an hour south of Nashville. And the home they were living in was a one-story farmhouse that was tucked along Kingdom Road, surrounded by land and family. And if you look on Google Earth, you turn off of Kingdom Road, and it's not like the house is immediately off the road. You kind of go down this, appears like a gravel driveway, past a couple of other houses, and tucked way back in the back of the field is the McLarens. Now, this house had been in the family for generations. It's where Bubba had grown up himself. There were 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a basement, and it was such a cherished home place for so many. There was plenty of space for the kids to play and explore. It was an amazing environment for them to grow up. Now, Chloie was born on June 23rd, 2002, and she was described as being bright and bubbly and full of energy. Her mom, Cheryl, had actually been told that she wouldn't be able to have children. And so Chloie was a complete surprise, but also an immediate joy. She loved being involved in everything. She always wanted to help out around the house. She loved riding around on the gator on the land. She had big blue eyes and a huge heart to match. After Chloe's birth, Cheryl did struggle a little bit, but by all accounts, she loved being a mom. However, those struggles ended up being exacerbated because Chloe's father very unexpectedly passed away. And so now Cheryl was a single mother, and just a few years later, almost to the day, along came Gage. Now, Gage was born on June 29th, 2005, and he was Chloe's half-brother, and shortly after birth he was diagnosed with something called Dandy-Walker syndrome, which is a pretty rare congenital brain condition that ends up affecting the part of your brain that's responsible for movement. But Gage never let this slow him down. He was a super happy, bubbly child. He was always by his grandfather Bubba's side. His shadow, his Buster was his nickname. He was always asking questions and always wanting to be a part of what the grown-ups were doing. And the two kids were inseparable, and Cheryl was doing the best she could to manage being a single mother. But Cheryl continued to struggle. She struggled with her mental health and addiction, and eventually it kind of took over and she was not able to care for her children any longer. So by the time Gage was 2 and Chloe was 4, she asked her parents to take over custody. And this was supposed to be a temporary situation just until she could get herself back on her feet. And her parents didn't hesitate at all. And that was just like Molly and Bubba. They were known in their community for being kind and dependable people. Bubba especially was the kind of man who would drop anything to help out a neighbor. So the McLaren home wasn't just a place to stay, it was a place to be loved. They were really great people, welcoming of absolutely anyone. And so they stepped up in these kids' lives without any question at all. Now, Cheryl did remain in her children's lives. She visited them frequently. Things obviously weren't perfect, but they were stable. And for 5 years of these kids' lives, they weren't just stable, they were actually thriving. Chloie and Gage started and were doing well in school. They had tons of friends, had cousins that also lived right down the road from the McLaren's home. And so they were really close to family they could play with. They had animals on the property. And so they spent their day kind of like running around outside, helping out with the chores, taking care of the animals, and being kids. They were living the dream country life. But this, unfortunately, brings us to the night of the fire. On Sunday, September 23rd, 2012, everything seemed normal. Neighbors reported seeing Gage and Chloie outside around 6:30 p.m. This was their typical. They were riding around on the gator, playing like they always did, and then they were called inside for the night. Now, they had school the next day, so it's assumed they probably went in for dinner, baths, and bedtime. But just 3 hours later, all hell broke loose at the McLaren home. Around 9:30 p.m., a 911 call came in from a passerby or a neighbor. Now, I'm assuming just based on how far back their home is from the main road, it was likely a neighbor that called into 911. Now, regardless, this caller said the McLaren home was absolutely engulfed in flames. And so firefighters raced out to the scene, and it was horrific. It was so much worse than I think anyone was expecting. The fire had spread so quickly that the walls were already collapsing left and right in the home. And being in a very rural area, the fire crews were limited not just in manpower, but mainly in access to water. They had to take multiple trips back and forth to different local water sources to extinguish the fire because they didn't have fire hydrants. It doesn't seem that they really had tank trucks either, at least not ones with the holding capacity to put out a fire of this size. And so they were frantically going back and forth, doing all they could to get this fire under control. And meanwhile, Cheryl, who lived in nearby Shelbyville, still didn't have any idea what was going on until she was awoken by her sister pounding on her door. Her sister frantically told her that their parents' house, where Cheryl's children lived, was on fire. Cheryl was distraught. She was fearing the worst, and she was so frantic and shaken that her sister had to help her get dressed for her to be able to rush to the scene. And when she finally arrived, the fire was just still raging. She tried several times to run around the home, find a way in, to help her babies, to help her parents, but there was no way. All she could do was stand there and watch as this home burned with her parents and children believed to be inside. And I cannot imagine the helplessness that she must have felt. That is probably one of my worst nightmares in the world, like worst scenarios I could possibly imagine having to witness and live through. Now, given the time of night, it was assumed that the entire family had been asleep when the fire broke out. It was about 9:30, and clearly it had been going for at least a little bit, but the kids were always in bed well before that, and Molly and Bubba, I guess, went to bed pretty much right after. So everyone was worried that maybe they didn't wake up to the fire, maybe they didn't smell it or feel it, and ended up being trapped inside of the house. Because if they had managed to wake up and realize what was going on, the first thing they probably would have done was get out. And so everyone believed they likely would have been seen at that point. They would have ran for help to firefighters, to neighbors. And so the fact that they hadn't been seen anywhere really put a pit in everyone's stomach. And because of the extreme nature of the fire, firefighters also had no way to get inside to try to save anyone. It wasn't until 4 a.m., hours and hours later, that they were finally able to get the fire under control. The house was nothing but a pile of ashes. When the firefighters were finally able to sift through all of the rubble, the heartbreaking search for the family began. Family had drawn up a layout of the house so that the searchers knew the general locations of the bedrooms of their loved ones, the best places to essentially search for their remains. And first, they discovered the remains of Molly and Bubba. They were in the basement, lying perfectly side by side. Now, this area was just below Bubba's room, the area where their bodies were found. And so at this point, it was assumed they had been in bed like it was initially believed. They had been peacefully sleeping and suddenly fallen through when the floor collapsed. Then a third body was found, and this one was near the children's rooms, so they assumed it likely belonged to one of them. As the search continued, a press conference was held in the early morning. It spoke of a tragedy of 4 lives lost in a blazing fire. They still hadn't found one of the bodies, but they fully expected to. And there was a grieving family outside of a generational home that had not just lost that and history and something that meant so much to them, but several of their family members within a matter of a couple of hours. But that tragedy would soon end up turning into a huge, unexpected mystery. As investigators continued to search, they were still trying to find that last set of remains. They continued marking the remains that were already there, observing those, and they came to a startling realization. That third set of remains that had been by the kids' room actually did not belong to one of the kids. Once they finally got a chance to sit down and look at it all and collect more of the bones, they realized it was actually the bones of the family's dog. So now they had found the bones of Molly and Bubba, even their small, I think it was like a small poodle, like toy poodle of some kind. They had found the remains of those three. Where on earth were Chloie and Gage? But despite relentless searches, their bodies were never found. Now, at first, authorities believed, we must simply be looking in the wrong place. Like, they have got to be buried deeper in the debris. After all, the fire had been massive, the kind that destroys everything. It was just piles and piles of ash. So they thought they just had to look better, look deeper, and bring in more resources. And so to make this job easier on themselves, because of all the space they had to cover and all of the debris, cadaver dogs were brought in. Surprisingly, they didn't make any hits at all. So they tried another tactic. Dr. Hugh Berryman, a renowned forensic anthropologist, arrived with a team of undergrads to assist in the search. And then they brought in fire investigators and arson specialists, and even bomb technicians combed the scene. And not just that, but as specialist after expert came up baffled and empty-handed with no answers as to where the kids were, they went even bigger. Teams that had worked the World Trade Center site after 9/11 came to sift through the debris. And surely, if anyone could find two children in a one-story farmhouse with a basement, it was going to be them. And so they showed up and they started moving debris out of the house wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow. They were sifting for bones and teeth. And experts on the scene said that fire does shrink bones, so they would be looking for bones that could just be a few inches long, but they should absolutely also be finding teeth. Like, there should be something of the kids in that house. And they were finding food items, small charred belongings. And they also ended up finding the hollow bones of the family's pet cockatoo, so a small bird. But even after this team finished searching, there was still no trace of Chloie or Gage. And despite several arson investigators visiting the scene, the cause of the fire could not be determined. And so at this point, they had two missing children, a fire that could be accidental, or maybe there was something else going on here. And so as days passed with no sign of the children, the theory that they had perished in the fire alongside their grandparents just continued to become less and less likely, especially when all of the experts started to weigh in, saying that it would have been virtually impossible for them to have died in the fire and their remains burn away completely. That's just not how it works, because a lot of people at this point were like, well, maybe the fire, because it was so hot, because it was so out of control and burned so long, it just totally disintegrated the remains of these children. But every single expert was like, that just doesn't happen. Dr. William Bass, the founder of the University of Tennessee's Body Farm, said, quote, "When you cremate a body in a crematorium and it is cooling down, when you open the door, you can still identify the bones, even if they are children." And he even added that children's skeletons have more bones than adults. And so it should have been even more likely that anything of the children should have been recovered. However, the sheriff's department, for whatever reason, stood by the belief that it was likely just an accidental fire, that the kids had likely died in the home, but not many people, including all the experts, seemed to agree with this line of thought. Now, Dr. Mike Tabor, the medical examiner, actually came forward after hearing this, heavily disagreeing with the sheriff's department. He explained that finding the birds' remains meant even more so that the children should have been found. What are the chances that something crazy conveniently happened to just the kids in the house, disintegrating their bodies and not that of a cockatoo? He went on to say, quote, "We looked at the remnants of the house fire on multiple occasions. I'm completely confident they weren't in there. So now we have to wonder, where are these children? And so it was at this point that the investigation took an unexpected turn. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation released a statement saying that all experts had conclusively determined that Gage and Chloie were not victims of the fire. And so now, with no answers and this really bizarre situation on their hands, the state issued an Amber Alert for both children, officially treating their disappearance as a potential abduction. Now, I know a lot of you guys are probably thinking, okay, well, there's like rules for Amber Alerts. Usually there has to be concrete signs children were abducted for an Amber Alert to be put into place. But from what I've been able to gather, this was done out of an abundance of caution. Because this was such a strange, bizarre, and potentially serious situation, they wanted to get information out there as fast as possible to bring these kids home. There was no information provided that I know of that indicated they were taken, no witnesses claiming to have seen anything along those lines. They just wanted to spread their faces and names, and so hopefully there were eyes out for them everywhere, because these are two very young children. But it also was a possibility that hadn't fully been ruled out. So it was still on the table that this could have been an abduction.
All right, Ron, the mystery just deepened overnight. The Amber Alert there suggesting that the children originally thought to have died in that horrible fire are alive. It took almost a week for this Amber Alert, but repeated searches for the children or their remains have turned up nothing. Overnight, Tennessee officials putting out a statewide Amber Alert. 9-year-old Chloie Leverette and 7-year-old Gage Daniel now considered missing with no clues to their whereabouts. It's been 6 days since a fire torched the home they lived in with their step-grandparents. Initially, it was thought the children and the grandparents all died in the flames. But after 6 days of exhaustive searching inside the rubble, there is only physical evidence of the grandparents, not the children.
If we just had ashes, you know, their little bodies, but we don't have anything.
The Amber Alert reads, the location of Chloie and Gage are unknown at this time. If you have any information concerning the children, please contact the TBI. It only applies to Tennessee. Authorities have no reason to think the children have left the state.
The fact that we don't have sufficient evidence from fire investigators right now to positively conclude that they died in this fire makes us want to make sure that they are not somewhere else.
They also considered possibilities that didn't necessarily involve foul play, like the fact that the children could have easily fled the fire and then just become lost in the woods, which does seem like a plausible theory. They would have been terrified, and if they had gotten out, not known where their grandparents were, it seems that they had searched the area directly around the house already for the children once they realized they weren't in the rubble of the fire, but they decided to expand it much further at this point. They wanted to expand the perimeter and bring in a lot more resources. So infrared helicopters scoured the area from above. They brought in not cadaver dogs this time, but scent dogs to look for any trail of the kids, indicating they had run from the home, and dozens of trained personnel were on foot in the fields. They checked the woods, the outbuildings around the McLaren's home, nearby creeks, abandoned barns, tree lines, and even remote dirt paths that hadn't been driven on in years, but they found nothing. The kids weren't huddled, scared in the woods somewhere, which, I mean, I feel like I didn't think this was the most possible theory, just because after several days and given the landscape of the area, I feel like they probably would have come out or been seen or known people were there to help them. But I'm glad that they did search. However, nothing was found. If the children had escaped the fire and wandered off, there would have been something: clothing, footprints, a scent trail. Plus, with Gage's diagnosis, he struggled with his balance, he had poor coordination. And so if they had made it out of the fire alive and tried to run to safety, it's not likely that they would have made it too far. And I feel like, knowing kids, being a parent myself, having been a kid that was horrified of the dark and the woods, I feel like had they gone out of the house, the only large area of woods they could have run to and potentially gotten lost in was behind their home. But when it comes to just common sense and what I think the kids would have done had that happened, most of the area around their house was open. They would have been able to see lights from several other houses in the area, and if they had just followed the driveway, they would have gone to what looks like potentially other people's homes. Now, I can't say that for a fact. It might have just been buildings on their property, but there were still several other places that they would have been able to see in the dark, lights from other people's homes right through fields, and I feel like that would have been the most likely place they would have gone to. Or the fact that they had family that lived close by. I'm sure they were very familiar with going to and from there on foot. I just don't feel like them turning around and choosing to run straight into the dark woods while they're already scared made the most sense. And since making it through a field probably wouldn't have been too challenging for them, it just now also wasn't seeming likely that they had run off on their own and somehow gotten lost, hadn't shown up anywhere. It just wasn't seeming as plausible of a theory anymore. So the most possible theory turned towards something darker. If the kids didn't perish in the fire and they didn't run away from it to the nearby woods or homes, is it possible someone took them before the fire even started? And if so, was the fire part of a deliberate plan? And so as the case shifted to a potential crime, attention turned to those closest to the children. And they also really wanted to look into autopsies for both Molly and Bubba to see if there was any sign that they died from foul play instead of just perishing in the fire. But unfortunately, because their remains had been in the fire for so long, both of their autopsies were fully inconclusive. Now, the farmhouse was really out there. So family said if someone decided to take the kids, if this was some big plot, it would have been someone that they knew, someone that knew where the house was. It had to have been purposeful. You wouldn't just randomly stumble across this one particular house in the middle of all this farmland and say, hey, this is the one that I think I'm going to target. And so authorities began to question every single person that knew the kids, knew the grandparents, neighbors, people from school, but they also looked a little closer than that. So Cheryl, their mother, and Gage's father, since Chloe's father was no longer living, were both questioned thoroughly. They had already been under DCS scrutiny years earlier, which was one of the things that led to the grandparents gaining custody. And so it's not uncommon for investigators to look into if the biological parents might have tried to take the children back. This is just an unfortunate thing that tends to happen. This is usually what you see when an Amber Alert is put out. And so both parents were brought in and they both fully cooperated. They submitted to polygraphs, answered every single question, and were ultimately ruled out as suspects. And even the TBI came out and said that they had no reason at this point to believe that either parent was involved. So who on earth would potentially want to burn this house down, killing Molly and Bubba, and potentially take the kids? They lived a pretty remote life. Everyone seemed to love and respect the McLarens. I don't think Molly or Bubba worked anymore at this point. Just from the way it's described, I can't say that for an absolute fact. So it's not like it was necessarily maybe like a business situation gone wrong. It just seemed so bizarre. Meanwhile, investigators revisited every detail of the fire scene. They wanted to know, was this fire intentionally set? And so more fire investigators, including experts from the ATF, and even a man who had worked the Oklahoma City bombing case, were brought in to take a deeper look. Like when I tell you they brought in the best of the best because nothing was adding up, but still not a single expert could find a definitive cause for the fire. And I genuinely think it is just because it burned so hot and so fast, but they did figure out why it burned so hot and so fast. So they ended up finding lots of things that were contributing factors. There were space heaters all over the home. Molly was also on oxygen, so there were several oxygen tanks. On top of that, Molly smoked, and unfortunately, at times, she would smoke directly beside her oxygen tank. There were also rumors of hoarding, and so there was stuff all over this home that could have exploded, added to the fire. I mean, it was really, really bad. Once a fire got started in that house, there was no way anyone was going to be able to stop it. But despite all of those things, none of them were found to have started the fire. Obviously, they took things like Molly smoking beside her oxygen tank into account, and they investigated all of these things, and they looked for signs that that was the source, but nothing. But what is very interesting is that Molly and Bubba had been found down in the basement. As I said earlier, it had initially been thought that they fell from Bubba's room above when the floor collapsed, because by the time firefighters arrived, walls of the home were already caving in, the floor caved in down into the basement. It seemed even more likely because they were seemingly like perfectly side by side, like they had been laying in bed and fell straight down. And while it seems very cut and dry, Further investigation revealed that's not what happened. They found debris on top of Molly and Bubba's bodies, indicating they had been down in the basement. Things from Bubba's room had fallen down on top of them. So why on earth were Molly and Bubba down in the basement lying perfectly side by side? Family had apparently already questioned them falling this way because, according to them, Molly and Bubba didn't even sleep together anymore. They slept in separate rooms on opposite sides of the house. I think it was like 20 feet apart to be exact. They each had their own health issues. It just worked better for them to sleep this way. And so when they heard Molly and Bubba were found together underneath Bubba's room, it just was not adding up. And so all of this information, not just knowledge of how this family typically lives, but also the investigation from fire experts and all of those things indicates that both Molly and Bubba were down in the basement. But why? And so this leads into another very interesting detail that you're going to hear and you're going to be like, absolutely, this makes perfect sense. But just like everything else in this case, that rug is going to be ripped right out from underneath of you. The McLarens had over 30 propane tanks stored in the basement from Bubba's old job. And so I heard this and I was like, absolutely, that'll do it. Like, that'll absolutely do it. Propane tanks are like one of my huge fears. I'm so scared they're all just going to spontaneously combust. And so I was like, this has to be what started this fire. Maybe a fire started down there from one of these tanks and Molly and Bubba rushed down to the basement to try and get things under control, unaware of the exact danger they were walking into. Like I said before, with all of the different things in this house that could add fuel to the fire, literally, if one of those tanks went, it was just a ticking time bomb. It was only a matter of seconds or minutes before another one of the tanks exploded and the fire became out of control. So obviously, investigators looked into these 30 propane tanks because, again, it seems like the most obvious source of the fire. And initially, it was believed that one of those tanks, if not a few of them, had ruptured. Now, on top of that, these tanks were stored directly under Chloie and Gage's room. And so maybe that could explain why the remains weren't found. Like, would that play any part in it? The fact that there was potentially a big accelerant underneath of them, but still, those puzzle pieces were also just not going together, not just in the eyes of the McLaren family, but investigators and experts as well. So if one of the adults had heard or smelled the fire, Bubba would have told Molly and the kids to get out of the house, and he would have tried to deal with it on his own. If even, he might have even tried to flee the house as well. But his family said it wouldn't be like him to let Molly go down in the basement with him, keep the kids sleeping like that if there was a potential danger. So it still was not making sense to them that both Molly and Bubba would have been down in the basement. When they investigated further into the tanks, while it did seem one or a few of them may have ruptured, however, there was no evidence that they had ruptured to start the fire or even ruptured during the fire because there was no sign of a large explosion that would have gone along with a ruptured tank. Like, there would have been very obvious markings and, fire patterns and all those things to support the tanks had ruptured, and they weren't finding it. And so ultimately, experts determined that these 30 propane tanks were not the cause of the fire. So what had once seemed like finally a solution, some sort of answer, didn't even turn out to be one. And it actually turned out that those tanks had been sitting there for over 30 years, and majority of them were actually empty. And so again, back to square one. So what else could have brought them down to the basement together, and why was nothing else down there found to be the cause of the fire? Because that seemed like the only rational reason they had gone down to the basement at that time of night. And that's when the McLaren family brought up something that they personally felt was really, really off. So when investigators went into the home, the basement door, I guess, had been open. Like, there was evidence that door was open. And Bubba, according to family, was adamant about keeping that door shut for safety reasons. Obviously, he had 30 propane tanks down there. He also kept all of his tools down there. Again, there's potentially a hoarding situation. And so I don't think he wanted the children or anyone to go down into that area of the basement. And so his family said that when you went down there, you shut the door behind you. Like, that door was shut at all times. And so they felt like it wasn't like him to keep that door open. So they wondered if maybe it wasn't him. Now, I will say that could be chalked up to if there was a fire in the basement, they could have frantically gone down there to put it out. And I can assure you, keeping that door closed was probably not a priority. But their family wonders if someone did it on purpose, because what ended up happening, because that door was open, it created a vacuum, feeding the flames, making that fire spread and burn hotter. And people that are arsonists, people that plan to start these fires, know things like that. So people started to wonder, the public, investigators, the McLaren family, if maybe someone came into the house that night. Maybe someone threatened Molly and Bubba, sent them down into the basement, started a fire, left the door open, making sure everything burned, and left with the children. It was the only way it made sense to family that Molly and Bubba were in the basement together, found side by side, perfectly like that, the way that they were. Bubba's sister, Mary Lamb, made a heartbreaking statement saying, quote, "If those children were not in that fire, then my brother died fighting for them. I honestly believe the children were murdered. I think somebody came, they let them in, they did what they wanted to do with the two adults, the house burned, and somebody took the children." And a few more odd details came to light that people have questioned over the years, and many people believe continues to point to foul play. So about a month or so before the fire, it ended up being found that Molly and Bubba had updated their will. And when they updated their will, they named Gage and Chloie as the new beneficiaries. The identity of the person that had been previously listed was never made public. I don't know if anyone even knows who it is. But this led people to wonder if maybe that person was angry to have been replaced. Maybe they wanted to get back at Molly and Bubba. And perhaps there ended up being a plan concocted to get rid of Molly and Bubba and take the beneficiaries, hoping to eventually still get that money, still get those things. But maybe when they realized afterwards that the logistics from that point on were going to be very complicated, they realized they had to keep those kids hidden or they were potentially facing murder charges, arson charges. It's possible they thought this would be a very easy, simple plan. They could pop up with the kids saying they found them, everything was fine. But when the ATF became involved and the TBI and arson experts and all these things, they were like, oh crap, now what do I do? And to add to this theory, according to family, the will was believed to have been stored in a safe in the house. But that safe was never found. Investigators couldn't determine if it had melted or if it had been taken before the fire. And while most safes are labeled as fireproof, they do still have melting points. Like they are still going to eventually give into the fire. And the fire at the McLaren home was definitely exceptionally hot. So maybe it did melt, or maybe someone took it to have the will and to be able to claim the benefits. But this is just another huge piece that can't be answered. But to this day, no one knows who could possibly be behind this. Who would have wanted to take those children? Did they want to take them for separate reasons, or did it have everything to do with the fact they had been named the beneficiaries and were now going to inherit everything of their grandparents, probably the house, the land, money, all of those things? And ultimately, all of these are just theories. And I feel like I can hear the comments now of people saying Occam's razor, like obviously they died in the fire. And I am definitely one that is very realistic. I like to look at the facts. I like to look at the information and be very realistic with it. But the one thing that I cannot get over in this case that I think is the most important factor in all of it is that all of the experts and the TBI say that those kids did not die in that fire. So something happened to them otherwise. Did they run off on their own and somehow haven't been found, or did someone take them? Investigators have received tips and sightings over the years, which was something that I was so interested in hearing about. I guess Chloie was reportedly seen at a restaurant in Tennessee about a year after the fire. And interestingly, a photo was taken of this girl. Like that's how much this person believed this is possibly Chloie. And this photo was then shown to Cheryl, and she fully believed this was her daughter. Authorities themselves even said that the girl in the photo very closely resembled Chloie, but this girl never ended up being located. Other potential sightings started to come in from places like California, New York, Colorado, Costa Rica, but none of them led to Gage or Chloie. Even stranger, in the months after the fire, they found that someone had been ripping down the missing persons flyers that had been posted all around town. And who would do that and why? Usually it's someone that doesn't want anyone getting to the truth, someone that wants people to stop looking. There are just so many bizarre aspects to this case. Despite all of this, the case remains unsolved and that Amber Alert is still active. I have literally never seen any other case where an Amber Alert's been active this long before, and they're still actively looking for answers. In 2022, 10 years after the fire, the TBI released age-progressed images of both Chloie and Gage. They would be 20 and 22 years old at this point, and they're encouraging everyone to spread those photos in case they are in fact out there somewhere. Their mother, Cheryl, still holds out hope that they are alive and well, and someone somewhere knows what happened to them.
Cheryl Daniel clings to the age-progressed photos of her daughter, Chloie Leverette, and son, Gage Daniel, the closest thing she has to school pictures.
It's a bittersweet feeling. I got something that can show me what they are and how they look, and then it's also the circumstance of why I have that.
The photos can only give her an idea because Chloie and Gage have been missing for 11 years. Investigators thought they died in a house fire with their grandparents, Bubba and Molly McLaren, in 2012 until they started searching. Officials found the couple's remains, the family dogs, and even a pet birds. There was no sign of Chloie or Gage. While some believe their remains turned to total ash, investigators say that's almost impossible. 11 years later, Daniel hasn't stopped.
It feels like more of 1,100 years. It seems like the longer they're gone, the worse it is.
Investigators never determined the cause of the fire. Daniel believes it was set on purpose and Chloie and Gage were kidnapped. Knowing in her heart they're still alive, she wonders where they are and what they're like now at 20 and 18 years old.
This situation, there's no word to describe how you feel because you go through so many different emotions. But it all comes down to nothing but pure, hellish heartache. It's a nightmare.
Daniel says the TBI and FBI have received new tips, but they've all come up short. Regardless, she'll never stop searching, dreaming of the day she'll see Chloie and Gage again.
This isn't about me, it's about finding them. And it's all about them. And I just want people to know that to please keep looking for them. Because I know somebody knows something, and they are out there somewhere.
And there's a pretty good reason why this case continues to haunt people and people continue to fight so hard for answers. Because 2 children didn't just vanish into smoke. According to all the experts, something happened and we need to find answers. I really am interested in hearing what you guys think about this. I feel like when you look at this case kind of just very black and white for what it is, you see all these ways that a fire could have started easily, would have continued easily, could explain all of these strange things. But then when you get into all of the experts and what they found, it contradicts everything. And that's so frustrating. And I feel like it is so incredibly rare. I fully expected what the experts found to confirm some of these theories, to confirm some of these ideas on how the fire may have started and why and all these things. And the fact that all of these experts are so baffled is absolutely wild to me. From what I've seen on Google Maps, that home has been rebuilt. So there's obviously no further investigating when it comes to that. So the biggest thing we can do is continue to share Chloie and Gage's photos. So let's do what we can to help try to find them. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Chloie and Gage's story. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video.